It's one business with which we're all familiar. It's also a business coming under attack by its regulator. This is Tonight. I'm Bruce Whitfield, and tonight we look at what Icasa hopes to achieve by taking on the tech and mobile giants. Joining me in Cape Town, Dominic Cull, who is the ISPA regulatory advisor, and Duncan McLeod, who's TechCentral's editor. Just give me a broad brushstrokes view here of what Icasa is doing with tech and internet service providers and cell phone companies.
Well, there's so much going on at the moment, but they've announced this broad probe into the state of competition in the sector, which I think is to be welcomed. I think it's long overdue. I think they should have done this a long time ago. But they really want to understand what are the issues holding back full competition across the various segments of the industry. So they're going to look at things like the pay television market. They want to understand why those pay TV licenses that they issued 3 or 4 years ago largely failed. We only had one company launching Top TV, now Starsat, and that's in business rescue. So they want to understand how they can help companies come into this market and compete with the incumbent multi-choice in the pay television market. They want to understand what's happening in the mobile market, how we can increase competition more than we have it at the moment, etc., etc. So it's a full review of the sector. They're going to be looking at postal services, competition to the post office, the whole ambit. So I think it's long overdue. Arguably, I think they should have done this a long time ago because they actually really need to understand the competition issues in the market before they can regulate. But it's to be welcome for sure.
Is Icasa under new management? What's brought this new broom in that says now is the time to look at virtually every single thing we do?
Well, I think part of it is probably the fact that we have a competent communications minister at last. I think he's doing a good job. He's pressing a lot of buttons and sorting out a lot of things. There's no doubt that the conversations going backwards and forwards between the Ministry of Communications, the department, and Icasa on what needs to be done in the sector. So I think that's probably played a big role. I think they've probably got a good leadership team at Icasa now, certainly stronger than it used to be in the past. And I think they're finding the courage to start to do things. I mean, we're starting to see, for example, this fight over mobile termination rates and the fact that it's now gone to court. I think in the past, Icasa would simply have rolled over and let the industry decide what the outcome was going to be. Now they seem to be prepared to take on some of the vested interests in the industry.
I want to catch up with that because you came from court earlier on today, and I want to find out what's going on in court there. Dominic Cull in Cape Town, from an ISPA perspective, the Internet Service Providers Association, you're the regulatory advisor there. What are you seeing in terms of the internet space? Because there's a lot of stuff happening globally with internet regulation.
Bruce, I think that's why this inquiry that Icasa has announced is interesting, and the actual notice only came out yesterday, so we've only had a short time to have a look at it. But it's all that Duncan says it is, and for me that's the boring bit. We already largely know what the problems are with competition in South Africa in the mobile industry and certainly in the subscription television industry. The more interesting part of this whole exercise is Icasa deciding that it's going to look into the future. And that's really what it should be doing. We're dealing with termination rates, we're dealing with SMS, we're dealing with things which are going to be irrelevant in 3 to 5 years' time. And the bit that excites us is where the regulator talks about the impact of convergence, a very badly understood term, but I think the regulator here means it in terms of the convergence to internet protocol, which is already taking place, and net neutrality, which is obviously a massive issue for ISPs in South Africa going forward.
Now, you need to explain net neutrality to us. It's something I only came across for the first time this morning. I know people like you and Duncan live in the world of desired net neutrality. It's becoming a big issue in the United States, less of a big issue in South Africa yet, but I suppose all these new regulations are going to bring it to the fore.
Indeed, and I think the debate is being driven by what's happened in the States and to a lesser extent what's happening in the European Union. And again, a badly understood concept. So net neutrality in its purest form is really advocating that ISPs, broadband providers, those who provide the pipes, must be absolutely neutral in terms of the traffic they carry on those pipes. It's to be distinguished from shaping prioritization, which we see often in South Africa from ISPs, from Telkom and others. In South Africa at this time, we don't have an abundance of bandwidth. It's expensive, so it's to be expected that ISPs will do some kind of shaping, some kind of traffic prioritization according to the different packages they offer in order to make the service usable. There are certain services, unshaped, uncapped services, which are available from some providers, but you pay for them. It's extremely expensive. And really it's very early days to take a position on this in South Africa, but I think what we will be looking at is to position net neutrality as being a non-discrimination issue. So if, for example, and I think there are two companies which would make good examples here. One is NASPAS through MultiChoice and MWeb.
Yep.
If MWeb, as a NASPAS company, is given the go-ahead to stream that content from MultiChoice, then it must do so on exactly the same basis as it does for competitors. It cannot favor it. And Telkom would be the other example. It's announced plans to start a video-on-demand service. And there's no objection to that, and there's no objection to Telkom taking such technical measures as it needs to in order to provide a suitable quality of service for that VOD service. But it must do so on a non-discriminatory basis.
Dominic, thanks very much for that. Duncan, for example, NASPAS owns MWeb. If you wanted to watch Apple TV or if you wanted to access Netflix in a world of net neutrality, you'd be able to sit in South Africa and do that if you're an MWeb customer. MWeb at the moment has got an excuse to choke off your Netflix or your Apple TV if they wanted to.
That's right. I don't think there's any evidence that that's happening at the moment.
But they could do it.
They could do it.
Yes.
So they could deprioritize Netflix, for example, if
Yeah.
Netflix came into the South African market and emphasize the DSTV service. So that's the concern. I don't think it's been an issue up to now, but it's going to be an issue in the future. So Icasa is right to look at this as a...
So Icasa is looking at that. In a perfect world, net neutrality provides equal access to the internet. Is it utopian or is it feasible?
I think we've seen net neutrality regulations being introduced in many markets around the world. I think, in my personal views, it makes sense. There are a lot of views about it. Some, I think, free market libertarians would argue that we shouldn't have this sort of regulation and that people should just be free to choose what they want to do, and businesses should be free to offer the services they want to offer. And if they don't want to offer a particular service to their customers, then they shouldn't have to do that, and they can go to an alternative provider. My personal view is that net neutrality regulations are required, but it is a point of contention for sure.
Dominic, where do you stand as the regulatory advisor to the Internet Services Providers Association? Are they all on board in terms of a regulatory framework?
I wouldn't say everyone's on board at this stage. It's very early, but Bruce, let's just remember that ISPA has a history of being on the wrong side of discriminatory conduct from incumbents, as testified to by the Competition Tribunal and the various settlements and actions against Telkom. So issues which regard discrimination between services of downstream competitors and an incumbent are going to be very sensitive ones.
But you would have the vested interests, just as we're seeing in the cell phone industry right now. The vested interests will want to protect their turf. You will have NASPAS wanting to protect its MWeb turf and want its content being streamed on MWeb. Is it comfortable, for example, with another service provider getting equal access to their content?
I can't speak for MWeb, and obviously there are going to be particular specific agendas at play here which ISPA will need to manage as it responds to this document. But I think it's safe to say that the general position from ISPA will be one which seeks net neutrality regulations which stipulate non-discrimination between services.
In practical terms, what does the internet look like 5 years from now, assuming that we do get net neutrality, Dominic?
Well, hopefully, I think the question of net neutrality is a little bit of a luxury as we sit here at the moment, given the state of broadband in South Africa and the number of people that we need to bring online. Certainly, I think we need to bear it in mind, because while we are addressing one divide, we certainly don't want to create another divide. And there's a danger that if we don't deal with net neutrality, we may just do that and create another tier of access between the wealthy and the not so wealthy.
Dominic Cull in Cape Town, thank you. Are we at risk of creating these divides? I didn't know that your world was this interesting and this complicated, Duncan. I know why you do it.
You should be a tech journalist. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a debate that's been happening in Europe and Asia and North America for a long time, and it's about time it came here. And we need to have this discussion before it becomes an issue. Absolutely.
Now, Dominic was describing the bit that you're doing at the moment, sitting in court, is the boring bit. But it is fascinating from the point of view that right now we have massive cell phone bills. We're having this whole debate around the issue of mobile termination rates. The chief executive of Cell C is sitting in court watching each day's legal proceedings. He's the only guy in the country who's not watching the Oscar trial part-time.
And me.
And you, because you're a professional and committed to your work. What's going on in court in terms of the internet, in terms of the cell phone providers?
Well, it's really a battle over these termination rates, which are the fees that operators charge each other. The Vodacom and MTN are really maintaining that Icasa failed to follow the correct procedures in coming up with these rates. Today, it was the turn of Icasa Senior Counsel to put their representations to the court, and they put forward what I thought was a fairly strong argument. They said that when the draft regulations were released, I think back in October or November last year, MTN and Vodacom at that time would have realized that that Icasa had come up with a set of rates that perhaps weren't based on the actual costs of terminating a call, and should have at that time taken their books to Icasa and opened their books to and said, well, here are actual costs, scrutinise them, have a look at these, but they failed to do that. And Icasa's senior counsel has argued that they could have done that, they should have done that, and failed to do so.
And by failing to do so, they've delayed till the last minute in order to extend then the period by which they can charge high mobile termination rates.
Exactly. The judge has indicated she's likely to make a decision on this on Monday, the 31st of March, a day before the new rates are supposed to come into effect. So yeah, it's all to play for at the moment. But as Dominic says, this is actually a short-term issue, because this whole voice issue is going to go away in 5 years.
Why does it go away in 5 years?
Because everything becomes a service that flows over the data network. It all becomes a voice over internet protocol, etc.
So it becomes basically like having the WhatsApp button in your phone, the WhatsApp app.
Exactly.
You hit WhatsApp, you do your SMSs using data. You're going to make phone calls with a phone call app that's there just as easy to access.
Precisely. Voice will almost certainly, for the most part, be a free service which is offered over the data network.
And won't that be fun? Because at the moment, it's a pricey thing. Well, again, how does the lack of bandwidth that Dominic refers to affect this particular space? Because we're going to need big buckets full of this stuff in order for all of us to be able to make our phone calls over the internet protocol.
Absolutely. And the networks, to be fair, are investing billions of rand in upgrading their networks. They've started to deploy 4G LTE networks. There's a lot more investment. Billions of rand every year being poured into these networks. I think what needs to happen urgently is that more radio frequency spectrum needs to be freed up so that these big operators can continue to expand, particularly their 4G LTE networks. They need access to spectrum around 800 megahertz and 2.6 gigahertz. It's been delayed by years. It's all related to the delays in the migration to digital terrestrial television. The two are intimately intertwined. And I think once we've freed up that spectrum, the operators will continue to invest in these data networks. Of course, the operators are very worried that they're going to become dumb pipes through this whole process. They're worried that companies like WhatsApp, which is now owned by Facebook, are going to disintermediate them effectively, and they're just going to be the data conduits through which other companies profit through voice and through a multitude of other services. So it's very, very interesting times in this industry.
And that's why there's a big fight over it. We love good fights. That was Dominic Cull in Cape Town. He is the Internet Service Providers Association Regulatory Advisor, and Duncan McLeod, who is the editor at TechCentral, techcentral.co.za. That's it from us for this evening. Thank you for watching. There'll be more tonight, tomorrow. Till then, good night.